Yo, good morning, sisters and brothers in Christ. I'm grateful to be joining you this morning from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, in part by choice and in part due to generational displacement from my family's traditional, ancestral, and unceded Haistach territories in the central coast of British Columbia. As Kathy mentioned, I am a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation and adopted into the Gwayasdams peoples of Guilford Island. My traditional name in Haistach is Gagwegilok, and my name in Kwakwala is Kwisalach, which means woman who travels to many places far away, a name that was given to me after I had joined the executive committee of the World Council of Churches. My areas of research as a theologian have traditionally been about the intersections of Indigenous epistemologies and Christian mission. Without a rehash of my entire dissertation, there are fundamental ways in which traditional Indigenous ways of being and knowing in the world are different than those of Euro-Western descent. There are several important distinctions I think are vitally important gifts that Indigenous peoples can offer back to the wider church and to Canadian society. But for the purpose of today's work, I limit it to two. The first is the question of the purpose of epistemology itself, and the second is a traditional worldview of abundance. Indigenous communities have had their own discrete epistemological perspectives and systems of thought for as long as Western philosophers have been contemplating questions of truth and knowledge, if not before. But until the late 20th century, they have not been discussed as such. In Indigenous epistemologies, there is less concern for the metaphysical principles that are of Euro-Western theology, and more concern for the simple everyday things around us. Unlike Western epistemologies that presume unquestionable truths that guide our lines of inquiry, for example, we can ask any question we desire in any way we desire, and the answer will remain the same. Indigenous epistemologies hold that how we act is not merely a response to stimuli. Rather, the way in which we ask questions, the way in which we act towards our relations guides us to the right answers rather than the other way around. Therefore, in Indigenous philosophy, the thinker is guided by the limits of questioning rather than the limits of reason. Meaning is not shaped by inquiry into the human mind, but rather by participation in right action. We also have limits on who should know what. The Euro-Western reaction of how can less knowledge be better is partly a result of that Euro-Western philosophy's incapacity to grasp the idea that certain things should not be known. I argue today that less can be better in many respects that modern society is not grasping. We are taught in the Euro-Western tradition that the basis of our economic system is how people allocate scarce resources for production, distribution, and consumption of goods, both individually and collectively, so micro and macroeconomics. And we are taught to be in competition for those scarce resources. Traditional Indigenous worldviews, however, differ fundamentally in that our communities viewed the world as a place of abundance. We approached the created world and the deeply intimate interdependencies of the ecosphere with humility and respect. We only took what we needed from the world around us out of that respect and out of a deep faith that enough was all that was necessary because there is always more. That approach kept the world in balance for our peoples until the 15th century and the arrival of colonial explorers and mercantilists whose need to amass great wealth was driven by a worldview of scarcity and competition. The result of 600 years of this drive to amass wealth has resulted in a deep upset to the delicate balance within our ecosphere, one that threatens human existence through the climate emergency and at deep cost to our human relationships. As a habit, I almost always preface anything I speak or write as a theologian by asserting my commitment to the idea that missiology matters and that theology matters. One of the critiques I hold alongside many scholars of Christian mission is that the concept of the missio Dei is never fully defined in a way that became tangible to us, and so in fact may have lost some of its influence that our churches, especially those of us from the ecumenical movement, hoped it might carry. And yet, accepting another Indigenous worldview that allows for multiple truth claims, there are also important ideas that this lack of definition can be Missio Dei's strength, even if it has also been its weakness. In the introduction to his book on Job, Gustavo Gutierrez reminds us that since biblical times and as early in theology as Thomas Aquinas, Christians have believed that God is a mystery. Posing the question whether theology is an impossible task as a result of this mystery, he goes on to say, no, the task is not impossible. But it is important to keep in mind from the very outset that theological thought about God is a thought about a mystery. I mention this here because it influences an attitude to be adopted in the effort to talk about God, end quote. This is the type of attitude I believe is required when taking a liberationist approach to what we are called to as churches who are preparing for the possibility of a new normal, though we know not what that normal looks like. We must assume a posture of humility, required by our respect for the mystery that is the divine, a posture that cautions us and inspires us. We are cautioned from the type of self-assuredness or the necessity of being right, that singular truth claims that are so common in Western philosophy, at the same time as we are inspired to discover the truths, plural, present in the world around us through our relationship with the earth and with others. Gutierrez goes on to say that just because something is hidden does not necessitate it remaining hidden. This is tied, from my perspective, to why we must link theology and liberation when it comes to our concept of mission. We find revelation by entering into deep relationships with the world around us, by our mistakes, by the hurts and successes and pains and joys of ourselves and others. It is through solidarity and relationship with the other that we come to understand systems of oppression and injustice. That revelation comes to us through relationships, and what was hidden to us is now no longer hidden. Gutierrez suggests that God is first contemplated when we do God's will and allow God to reign. Only after that do we think about God. To use familiar categories, contemplation and practice together make up a first act. Theologizing is a second act. Theologizing done without the meditation of contemplation and practice does not meet the requirements of the God of the Bible. In liberationist thought, most theologians and practitioners establish that there needs to be conversion for both the oppressor and the oppressed in society. Given the psychological tendency of humankind to resist challenges to power and acknowledge complicity in systems of oppression, we must remain vigilant and continue to raise voices that conscientize both the oppressor and the oppressed, resulting in the conversions necessary for both the sinned against and the sinner. Brazilian liberation theologian Claudio Carvalhais from Union Theological Seminary, at the 2014 National Meeting of the American Academy of Religion, presented a paper that challenged that lack of humility and respect. He preached, if we are to glorify God, then we have to go out and love all of our neighbors, sisters, and brothers of all faiths to make sure that they have everything they need to have a dignified life. So if we are to live this gospel, our prayers, the prayers of the people, would have to start with, God forgive me, for I have more than my brother. By your mercy, I am going to share what I have. This would be a gospel that fosters deep solidarity and mutual social life without a class divide, perhaps. It's stupidity, brothers and sisters. It's stupidity according to the logic of the market empire that shaped our liturgical theology and moral habits. But it's the stupidity of a radical God, and it's the stupidity of radically God and other-oriented people. We are all foreigners on this earth, right? The earth is not ours. It is not Monsanto's. The earth belongs to God, and we, the earth's temporary inhabitants, all have the same rights of access to the same things. We need prophets to push us forward. And he quotes Heschel at the end of his paper saying, the prophet's word is a scream in the night. While the world is at ease in sleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. The prophet reminds us that few are guilty, but all are responsible. The intercultural issues I've raised, coupled with a deep commitment to liberative praxis, are part of what informs the areas where I believe there is deep urgency for policy reform in Canadian society for a new normal. While I see the outcomes of our democratic failures to address these issues in a particularly stark way in the downtown east side of Vancouver, this is the country's poorest urban postal code, we are failing each other in all communities and at all levels of society and governance in this country. So the issues I raise for you in your discernment and in your conversations with our politically elected leaders this week. First, inadequacies of the Canadian healthcare system, fissures made more visible, especially in the pandemic, and the effects on our most vulnerable, including and especially seniors living in long-term care. Poverty reduction. From my perspective, we do not have a serious poverty reduction strategy in most provinces or nationally. In British Columbia, income assistance for a single person was just raised from $710 to $935 per month. The average price of a rooming house in this neighborhood is $580 a month. That leaves $355 per month, or approximately $11.80 per day, to cover the cost of food, transit, toiletries, and clothing. Never mind if you have medical expenses or would like access to a phone or the internet. The average price of a one-bedroom apartment in Vancouver is nearly $2,000 a month, not even possible for somebody on income assistance. We tend to view poverty as moral individual failing rather than the systemic inability to find balance and right relationships with each other. This is the direct result of a worldview that puts us in competition with each other for scarce resources. I saw a great meme on social media last week that said, if you can't afford a living wage for your employees, you don't have a viable business model. Third is housing as a human right. Housing unaffordability and growing homelessness is a problem across Canada. There was a disturbing article in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago that said the average price, not the median price, but the average price of a single family home in Canada is $750,000. I don't know about where you live, but in Vancouver, the median individual income would not support any type of affordability at that level of cost. Homelessness, in my view, will continue to grow until we really take seriously housing as human right and include not just supportive housing and deeply affordable housing, but housing for the middle class that is affordable, for reinvestment in public land trusts and in co-ops. We need a whole continuum of housing options in order to make life livable and to maintain the prosperity that we have developed over the last 100 years in Canada, not least of which being addressing Indigenous housing crises. The fourth is drug policy reform. Drug use is not a criminal issue. It is a medical and a public health issue. Drug trafficking, yes, is a criminal issue and should be treated as such, but individual drug use needs to be treated as the medical issue that it is, without stigma. And again, that stigma stems from a judgment that drug use is individual moral failing, not the numbing of pain and trauma that science can prove that it is. UNDRIP and true Indigenous consultation. Being in right relationship with each other means participating in right action. Settler society needs to stop seeing the recognition of Indigenous rights as an existential threat, but rather an invitation to be in right relationship with each other and with the ecosphere. Somebody in my Bible study small group mentioned political division. I moved to Berkeley, California in 2008. And in my view, the political discourse I hear in Canada is exactly what I was hearing at the beginning of the election of Obama to his first term in government. And if we think that we can't get to where the US was during the Trump presidency, we are sorely mistaken, because that is exactly where we are headed. And we need not to be furthering political polarization, but having deep, nuanced conversations with each other from a position of humility and respect, and really learning to be transformed by the presence of the other, whether that is politically or economically or socially. And lastly, the climate emergency. Eschatology always seemed like some far off, unimaginable coming of the end times. And I'm sad to say I am terrified for the lives of my children that will be radically altered in their lifetime. I cannot imagine what the world will look like when they are 75. So in closing, so I leave time for Sue, I want to end with the famous Thomas Merton prayer, which I hope will guide all of us. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. May it be so. Amen.
So thanks again. It's very good to be with you this morning. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehouk, and Aduandaran peoples, the original caretakers of this land, which is also called London. You know, we often talk about how the pandemic has highlighted social and economic inequity, but we also know that a virus which jumps from animals to humans is reflective of the pressures that people are putting on this planet. In fact, these pressures have become so great, scientists are now considering whether the Earth has entered an entirely new geological age, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. We are the first people to live in a geological age, which is defined by human choices. The question is, what will we, this first generation of the Anthropocene, be remembered for? If the current trajectory continues, we will be remembered as a generation overwhelmed by social, political, economic, and planetary imbalances, which created a collision of crises. Globally, inequalities continue to be stark, and the global vaccine distribution is just one more example of long-standing patterns of inequity. And while the pandemic rages, record numbers of people continue to be forced from their homes by conflict and crisis. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, water insecurity, toxic pollution are all adding to the shocks and cumulative impacts and exacerbating inequalities. Social mobility is down, social instability is up. There are worrying signs of democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism. And collective action on anything from COVID-19 pandemic to climate change becomes more difficult against a backdrop of polarization and social fragmentation. In Canada, we see clearly how the social and economic fallout from the pandemic exacerbates slow-burning structural injustices, such as gender inequity, structural racism, precarious work, and the exploitation of migrant workers, to name just a few. And all of that is happening in the context of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and environmental pollution. If we see these issues as separate, we will be overwhelmed and never get to the root causes. If we see them as connected, we quickly become aware of the need to change the economic model, because the current model is rooted in a vision which sees all of creation, people, land, trees, water, air, as raw material awaiting exploitation, rather than an interconnected web of life with each creature valuable in its own right. Getting to a new economic model is not just an economic task, but it's also social, cultural, religious, spiritual, political, and environmental. We need change that touches the inner patterns which shape our human consciousness, as well as change in the systemic structures which shape the world. We need fundamental change that will impact the way we interact with land, water, other species, each other, and with God. This task and this time, I suggest, are tailor-made for faith communities. But are we ready to be what this time needs us to be? The French poet Charles Péguy wrote, "Everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics." If we as churches want to be what this time needs us to be, I believe we need to immerse ourselves in both mysticism and politics. Now, when I say mysticism, I'm not talking visions and extraordinary experiences, but rather a deep, even intimate sense of the pervading presence and power of grace in this life. There are two aspects of mysticism I want to touch on here because I think they're critical to moving toward a just transition. The first is an intuitive sense of the interconnectedness of life. We know we arrived at these intersecting crises by seeing ourselves primarily as separate and set apart from God, each other, and earth entities. A basic stance which feeds into all the isms, racism, colonialism, anthropocentrism, and more. By contrast, the life of Jesus Christ illumines the heart of creation story. God's love flows into and interacts with earth and humanity. God and humanity, humanity in God, humanity as part of creation, and God at the heart of creation. Love flowing in and love flowing out. Mechtilde of Magdeburg echoed this understanding of creation when she wrote, "The day of my spiritual awakening was the day I saw and knew I saw all things in God and God in all things." This reminds us that communion is not most fundamentally a liturgical event, but rather the liturgical event expresses the truth and depth of our interconnectedness. God is drawing all of creation forward into a common planetary destiny. And growing intimacy with God and growing in right relationship with earth and each other are intertwined and interactive movements which cannot be separated. Second, by trusting in the presence and power of grace, mysticism draws us into transformation in this life. All suffering, all death and injustice hold within them the possibility for healing, wholeness, and new beginnings, because God permeates all of life and tethers us to the sacred wholeness which has not yet reached completion on earth. The collision of crises in the world is urging us into such a transformation. The awareness that human choices and actions now have planetary-wide impacts is a wake-up call that we need to choose and act from this deepening sense of interconnectedness. And this moves us from mysticism to politics, because government policies and budgets shape to a great extent how we live our relationship with land, water, other species, and each other. So I'd like to use the remaining time to look more closely at the impacts of a few long-term policies and to identify some political responses which might contribute to a just transition. Women have long experienced barriers to the labor market. And when the pandemic started, women were hit first and hardest by job loss. Their jobs have also been among the slowest to recover. Here you can see the recovery of women's jobs clearly falling behind in July. In vulnerable sectors, which disproportionately employ low-waged, racialized female workers, were especially hard hit. Women have been further marginalized from the labor market by responsibilities for the care of children. Racism in policing has become an explosive social issue, but racism in the labor market is just as devastating and provides stark examples of the need to decolonize our minds, hearts, and systems. Here we see racism in incomes that are earned. But there are also clear indicators of racism in levels of unemployment during the pandemic. Precarious work with low pay and bad working conditions is a growing phenomenon. More and more people work full-time and live in poverty. You can see here that the prevalence of minimum wage work has increased sharply in the last 15 years. And the demographics for who is working in minimum wage jobs are also changing. So we shouldn't be surprised to see growth in the number of people accessing the food bank whose primary source of income is employment. And that's just a fraction of the food insecurity problem in Canada, since most people experiencing food insecurity don't even go to a food bank. As a society, we still punish people who aren't working. Just look at the levels of social assistance and compare it with the red line CERB level during the pandemic. CERB being what the federal government figured was a minimum amount people needed to survive each month. And that still didn't meet the low income mark cutoff. And then there are the places where poverty, racism, and gender inequity intersect in oppressive ways. For example, in this chart, the first 3 columns show steady increases in the number of immigrants, often racialized, working as low-wage nursing aides, orderlies, and PSWs. The darker blue indicates that it's mostly women. We need to pay attention to how the global economy relies more and more on low-paid migrant workers. Host countries like Canada get cheap labor for labor-intensive sectors of the economy. And home countries benefit from the remittances which migrant workers send home to improve the living standards of their loved ones. Meanwhile, the workers themselves are left vulnerable to exploitation with little possibility to remove themselves when it occurs. This chart is a stark reminder of disparity in Canada. If you just focus your attention on the bottom 3 lines, you'll see that the wealthiest 20% of Canadians own 73.5% of the wealth, and the poorest 40% own just 1.2% of the wealth. That's the kind of disparity that erodes social trust. Corporate profits have been rising steadily over the last 30 years, and the corporate tax rate has fallen. In theory, these tax rates were supposed to lead to job creation, but that's not what happened. They led to further profits through stock buybacks. Then there's this slide showing a 10% drop in individual taxes, a 21% drop in corporate taxes, and billions of dollars lost each year to tax loopholes and tax evasion. This is billions of dollars which the government can't spend on things like affordable housing, pharmacare, childcare, long-term care, healthcare, or reconciliation. And despite the recent strengthening of our goals for our emissions cut, Canada is still nowhere near where it needs to be, not in terms of domestic emissions, nor in terms of international climate financing to help developing countries reduce emissions. This slide shows the differences between the UK and Canada on climate action. Canada hasn't come close to meeting our commitments, seen in the red circles with the dot in the middle, while the UK has exceeded theirs. One key difference, the UK has had a climate change accountability legislation since 2008. All of these patterns point to the need for a new social contract with each other and with Earth. Now, there are easily a dozen key policies which are critical to a new social contract. And I don't have time right now to go through them all, although we could touch on them later in the discussion if you'd like. But I would like to touch briefly on two key leverage points for creating change toward a just transition. Care work is essential work and has been undervalued in Canada for too long. Ongoing investment in the care economy could create a real shift toward decent work, low carbon jobs, and economic growth that has much less focus on material consumption. But this investment has to go beyond childcare spots, as critical as they are. Fundamental tax reform is how we pay for the new programs we need. Fundamental tax reform can curb tax avoidance and tax evasion. And it's possible if we can get global cooperation. That would make tens of billions of dollars added to Canada's bottom line each year. Economists have shown how it can be done through the creation of an easily achieved global asset registry. This is an ongoing conversation at the UN, and Canada should be in there helping to move it forward. A global minimum corporate tax rate, which Biden has been pushing, can also be helpful. Canada should be working hard to bring these changes into place. As I conclude, it seems a good time to turn to the poet Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote, "Do not lose heart. We are made for these times." Or if I may be so bold as to edit a bit, we are being made for these times by grace. Too often, we have shrunk religion by making it a personal matter and limiting it to personal salvation. Too often, we have separated the reign of God from the workings of our society and economy. What Jesus preached was the inbreaking reign of God. It's a new consciousness that incarnates a new way of being in the world, one that is aware of being in communion with God, earth, each other, and chooses and acts out of this awareness to transform hearts and minds as well as the structures which create injustice in the world. This is where mysticism and politics unite. And this, I believe, is how faith communities can be what this time and this context need us to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Lots and lots to think about there in both presentations. Thank you so much for stimulating our thinking on the questions before us. And so now we have time until 11:30 for you to ask questions of the speakers. I invite you to signal that you wish to raise your hand, and I think it's Jonathan who is going to help us to recognize those who want to ask a question. And if you wish to ask one of the speakers in particular, feel free to do so, but I will be asking each of them to respond to our questions. And then at 11:30, we'll turn our minds also to preparing for the afternoon. But we're wanting to focus on both the role of the Canadian Council of Churches and then secondly, visions for Canada moving forward. Questions?
Paul Ledesure has his hand up.
Go ahead, Paul.
Just to break the ice a little bit here and give other people a chance to formulate questions. One of the drivers of the world economic system for the past, well, since the Industrial Revolution is really the concept of growth. The general theory being that with increased growth and wealth, it will be possible to take care of the minimum needs of more and more people, whether on a national scale or even an international scale. So the question I have, a very broad general one, that I think economists, at least progressive economists, are more and more working towards, is a concept of no growth. That growth is not the model. And the question I would have, is it possible to envisage the kind of world and measures that you advocate in a context where there is no growth. In other words, a stable economy that would not provide a surplus that could be distributed in some fashion or another. Is a no growth option a realistic one? And in my view, perhaps the only realistic one.
Can I ask Sue, would you like to lead, and Carmen? Or?
Sure, yeah, and there's a bit of a division between progressive economists, as you kind of alluded to. Some looking to the degrowth model, others looking to what kind of growth is healthy for the earth and for society. So I think maybe a bridge between those two divisions is found in that care economy model. That sense of where the growth we're talking about there is not growth that is rooted in material consumption. It's not growth that is about profit making. In fact, what we've been seeing in the care economy, especially in this pandemic, is that the nonprofit sector has been much more successful in providing good care outcomes than the for-profit sector. So that might be a bridge between those two camps, in that sense that some growth that is about caring for each other and caring for the planet can be a good thing, and especially when it's rooted in a nonprofit model.
Carmen, would you like to?
Yeah, in some ways, the no growth model is, or both models, but Sue just explained the differences between, reflect a more indigenous way of being. Traditionally, in the coastal peoples of British Columbia, that our economic and social systems were based around the potlatch. We had a lot more hierarchy in terms of, like, compared to other indigenous peoples from east of the Rockies. However, power and prestige were attained through the ability to care for the other. So the purpose in gathering great amount of wealth was to prove how many people you could care for. And so the richest hereditary chiefs were the ones who were left with nothing at the end of the winter potlatch season. And also operating from a world of abundance where they gave everything they had because of the belief that that generosity would be reciprocated and that they would also be cared for by their neighbors. And you know, not to romanticize it, we still had slavery and other things that were deeply problematic, but not in the sense of like the chattel slavery of the mercantilist era and the new Jim Crow in the US. I think that Sue talked about the converging crises in our society, and I think in many ways the climate crisis is deepening that fear of scarcity. The number of billionaires who are making climate and world military conflict bunkers in like remote areas of New Zealand and other places in the world they believe to be safe speaks to that. I have to take care of myself and amass as much as I can because the end times are near and I'm going to try and survive the climate apocalypse or the political apocalypse or whatever is coming. I think that the rise in like apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic literature and movies and pop culture speaks to that existential dread that communities are experiencing. I have to admit, I'm not particularly hopeful because we can talk about supporting, progressive economics, but the truth is that the corporations that hold the power of influence over especially North American politics is really disturbing. And I don't know, like, what will cause repentance, what will cause the collective turning around of that worldview, and that it's almost like an administrative evil, not in the same sense of like the Holocaust, where they had all of these like individual decisions sort of following a party line that resulted in this mass genocide, but also very much like that, like no individual, right up to a CEO of a company, many people feel is super challenging, like Monsanto, sees their individual actions as evil. And yet there is an aspect of evilness to the corporate outcomes of the way that business model is working. And that is such a challenging conversation to have. And I think we need to have it. Like, to be in right relationship with each other means that we have to keep trying to bring about that repentance together.
Thank you.
Willard Metzger had his hand up next.
Right, and okay, and then we'll take a question. There was a question in the chat too. I'll take that one. Willard?
Yeah, I'm afraid maybe I'm asking somewhat of the same question, but I think I am drawing in the question from Father Peter Conger and something both, really, I think. Citizens for Public Justice is having a conference right now as well, calling Seeking Justice. And a key theme that's coming through that is that capitalism and poverty are inseparable. That the whole sense of capitalism will create poverty. And so if you want to address poverty, you really have to attack capitalism. So I guess that's part of the question that I have. What are your thoughts on that? And then kind of moving into thinking of our conversation this afternoon, like a lot of the appeals are appeals of morality. And can we really look to the government to be those moral champions? So that's where I guess I'm bringing into their church and state, conversation. So I'm not sure if I can frame it in a question, but just comments on that dynamic. Because really, I mean, I'm afraid that this afternoon we'll say things that the government will just expect to hear from faith leaders. Yeah, of course, that's what they should be saying, and we expect them to say that. But how do we break through that somehow? But yeah, I don't know. Am I making any sense to anybody?
Sue or Carmen or Al's? Actually, there may be others too who want to engage that discussion.
I can jump in quickly. I don't want to get in the way of others who might want to contribute. So let me know if others are there. Willard, I think you make a good point. Certainly the current model of capitalism and poverty are inextricably linked. So part of the conversation is, are there other models of capitalism? And we have seen other models, even glimpsed them in the past. So for me, a key there is to kind of create more of a disconnect between capitalism and the pursuit of unbridled profit making. We're seeing that not just in the real economy, but in the financial markets as well. So that's a disconnect that I think is both a moral disconnect, and that point needs to be made. But there are also very clear structures and systems that help us to make that disconnect. And I think that's part of the work of churches to say, this is the moral ground that we want to get to, and these are structures that will get us there. And so I think the conversation needs to happen on both of those levels if it's going to move forward effectively.
Carmen, did you want to engage that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, I agree with you. I think that the current understanding of capitalism is one understanding of capitalism. And oftentimes when I hear people criticize capitalism, I say, well, which capitalism do you mean? You know, like I actually don't think that our economic system is a capitalist system. I think it's a neo-mercantilist system that is based on raping and pillaging the earth and is not guided by an invisible hand of the market. It is not guided by supply and demand. It is guided by an arbitrary and artificial manufacturing of goods, and then the creation of a demand for those goods through marketing, and that is not, in fact, what the early economic thinkers that imagined capitalism ever imagined for us. And I also think that the invisible hand of the market was sort of the moral compass that was envisioned by a deep commitment to largely Christian faith, coming from that Euro-Western tradition. And so that's not often an argument I win with people, because in practice we do call our economic system capitalism. But I think it's important to name that history and the fact that what we call capitalism is not what capitalism intended. I also think that capitalism can allow for progressive taxation that allows for sort of course correction around the inequities that are created through some of that unbridled pursuit of profits. I think that there are some fairly simple legal fixes in public policy, you know, that if we change the way that C corporations in the United States put shareholder profits as the primary purpose, like the existential purpose of a corporation, that in itself would challenge the inequality that comes out of our economic system. Like the existence of B Corps and the triple bottom line, I think, is very hopeful for our future. And looking at the societal impacts of our corporate business models and the environmental impacts of our business model, and saying you actually have to profit in all three in order to be a sustainable company, and the creating of a separate legal structure for that. But you know, you can look at the progressive tax programs in Scandinavia, and the generally you know, there's probably an underreporting of income disparity in Scandinavia compared to what is actually felt in practice. But you know, in Norway, it's the top 1% only own 10% of the wealth, which is significantly better than in North America. And so I don't necessarily think we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you know, the only other economic schema I think that people can imagine over and against contemporary capitalism would be communism and the Marxist philosophy, and that hasn't proven to be very successful either. I think we've shown that both economic systems can result in dictatorship and authoritarianism, and so I think, for me, the reason why I remain committed to liberationist praxis is because I feel like if our democracy centered the most marginalized and the most oppressed and their lived experience in their policy decisions, life would be better for all. That graph that Sue showed with the very, very rapid movement of capital from the government to the middle class in order to preserve their, the bare minimum of life compared to what we provide for people on income assistance or people living with disabilities is very stark. And so why is it that we haven't found a way to actually provide the bare minimum of dignity to the least among us? you know, and it's the same in the US. I happen to be a dual citizen because I exercised my J Treaty right as an Indigenous woman to recognize the border as irrelevant, and also happened to marry an undocumented worker when I moved to California. And so me becoming an American made his sorting out of that situation significantly easier. So we've benefited financially, both in terms of the Canada Child Tax Benefit augmentation in Canada and the pandemic payments that, you know, the 3 economic stimulus payments that have come from the US. And I just think, like, if we can make this happen so quickly, why haven't we been able to make it happen over the last 40 years, as income assistance rates have nowhere kept up with inflation? And also the CERB payments and are problematic because they were designed with the middle class in mind. And, you know, we have a community volunteer income tax program. We file over 3,000 tax returns a year for Vancouver's poorest community members, many of whom in the downtown east side were enrolled in CERB by predatory drug traffickers, who basically got them set up for CERB, took a cut, and said they could use the balance of the payments for drugs. People living on income assistance, and now because they're not, they were never eligible for CERB in the first place, they're part of that community of, like, dishonest people perceived by the federal government to be taking advantage of CERB, and are now going to face garnishment of their income assistance because the system was not set up to protect those who'd be most vulnerable. And I think, you know, that's really the point that we have to consider, is like, how do we ensure that any decision we make is taking into account the most vulnerable? And I think capitalism could be better if we did that.
Thank you each, and lots more to think about there. We're just, there was a question in the chat that I'm wondering if you have thoughts. You've already spoken a bit about it, but what strategic initiatives should we initiate, was the question. Are there some, at this moment, are there some strategic initiatives that you think the churches should initiate?
Yeah, so
thoughts?
I mean,
you mentioned some in your speech.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I played my hand a little bit in my presentation, in the sense that I think focusing on a care economy is critical, and the next point being that we can pay for it, and there are easily achievable methods through tax reform, and it's just a matter of getting that done. Like, economists have, for the last 5 years, have been pointing to, this is the way to get it done. This is the way to get those billions of dollars back in your government coffers. And I would suggest that we need to be pushing our governments to do that.
Perhaps a role for the churches themselves in the care economy as well, right? I mean, churches are players themselves in the care economy, so there's a good intersection there. Carmen. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
You've been.
When I think of, like, which thread to pull first, for me, I mean, it's in part shaped by the experience of being Indigenous in Canada, and in part shaped by the experience of leading this outreach ministry in the downtown east side of Vancouver, but like a true attempt at poverty reduction in Canada. And I think that care economy she talks about is a big part of that. And the pay equity issues that exist are a part of that. And that's an area, I think, where the churches can do some deep self-reflection. When I first joined the executive of the General Council of the United Church of Canada, sort of as an ex officio member because of my role in the WCC, the church had engaged in a pay equity study and expected to find that there would be some pay equity issues in the National United Church, or in the church more broadly, the United Church more broadly across Canada, but that it would not be as bad as mainstream Canadian society. And what they found was that we tracked exactly parallel, that women were paid 77 cents on the dollar, given corrections for the same levels of education and experience and size of congregation and things. And the response of my colleagues was shocking because they could not accept that this could possibly be true. The response was, well, the report must be flawed. That's not possible in the United Church of Canada, where we have these like very liberal, sometimes challengingly liberal perspectives on social inclusion. And I was on the executive for 7 years and we never discussed it again. And as a young woman, I have not been interviewed for lead congregational ministry jobs because the congregation couldn't possibly conceive of having a woman as the lead minister. In 2007, when I was ordained, in 2015, in 2021, there are congregations in our communities that would never, ever appoint a lead minister who was a woman. And, so we have to put we have to practice what we preach in terms of social policy reform. And I think getting to that point around the separation of church and state, when I think we have to stop, we have to have conversations in Canada about the fact that that's not actually a thing in Canada. That's actually very much an American thing, and it's also an artificial construct in the US, but we don't actually have the requirement for separation of church and state in Canada legally. The second is that the very staunch atheist views that would hold that the churches should not have any say because we're guided by a single book is a confrontation to the churches to be humble in that approach. Like, a large part of my dissertation was how can I possibly, given all of the abuses done in the name of the church, still be Christian as an Indigenous woman? And there is much to question about the abuses that are perpetrated in the name of God by the church today, not just in history. And so my caution there is to approach it with humility and also reserve the right as communities of faith to continue to raise public moral questions about who we are as a Canadian society.
Thank you, and thank you for incorporating a little bit of answer to that question. Also, what does Jesus teach us about our church-state relations? And so we're moving into a time also when we wanted to ask members of the board to be thinking about questions for this afternoon. I just want to remind you that those questions can be emailed to Peter as we conclude this session. And if you can also suggest during who might ask that question, that would be helpful for the group that is preparing for this afternoon. So, but I don't want to end our time. We're going to take steal a little bit of time from the calendar and continue until 11:45 here. So are there any other questions? Or Sue, did you want to comment on this question of what does Jesus teach us about the church-state exchange?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Jesus was politically engaged. You don't end up crucified for nothing. And so, if we want to root it in scripture, it's right there. But I guess I would also bring it forward in that sense that to me, the critical thing about church-state separation is that we don't want church authorities having political authority. That's the root of that, and that's not what goes on in our society anywhere near that. So I really kind of see that whole discussion as a bit of a red herring.
Right.
And if I can just add one more quick thing, there was a question about humility, approaching these questions with humility, and I just want to say that I think the basis for that is we are a part of the systems that we're critiquing. We are enmeshed in them. Many of us benefit from them. So I think we can only approach this with humility.
Right. And a second part of that question was, how do we approach it from abundance, right? As we move in those circles. So those are things for us as board members to be thinking about. Are there other questions? Any board members who would like to ask a question while Sue and Carmen are with us? Any other questions that anyone would like to ask? And at the same time, we invite you to, as I said, submit questions to Peter that you would like to see asked later this afternoon when we are in dialogue with our government. But we have opportunity now. There's still time also for questions about what the role of the church. Jonathan, are you seeing any hands I'm not seeing?
There are no hands.
No hands.
This is a group that likes to talk, so I'm sure someone can click a hand and raise their hand.
Well, you've given us so much to think about. I could come up with 1,000 questions here. I'm sure we're all thinking about all the many dimensions of what you've challenged us to think about in terms of our own internal workings in the church and how we, and also then our contribution to a way forward for Canadian society at this moment in time. I'm going to allow people then time to be, maybe you're framing your questions and thinking about that as well. I want to, on behalf of all of us, express our deep gratitude to you, Sue and Carmen, for your contributions to our thinking this morning. As I've mentioned already, you've given us lots to think about. We will be taking it away with us, not just today, not just for this afternoon, but I'm sure into the work of the commissions of the Canadian Council of Churches. As you were speaking, I was thinking about past moments in the commissions on which I was engaged, and I was thinking, oh, we could have worked with that. We could have worked with that. So I'm sure that what you've contributed today will be going forward in the work of the commissions of the Council of Churches, even long after today. And we also want to ask for blessing on your own work. I know both of you are deeply engaged in this conversation we're in Canada, in your own individual work and as part of our church community. And so we certainly pray for God's blessing on your own missions and your contributions to the church as well.